Hi, this is Annette Dubrouillet, and today I'm going to be reading Chapter 3 of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. If you haven't heard Chapters 1 and 2 that I've read before, go back and find them on YouTube, and you can listen to those first before you listen to this one. And by the way, if you want to be notified of when the next chapter is going to be available online, all you have to do is look underneath the video here on YouTube and click the subscribe button, and then they'll notify you when the next video comes up. Okay, today's chapter is Chapter 3 of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle by Betty MacDonald, and this is called The Answer Backer Cure. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Mrs. O'Toole put a peanut butter sandwich and a nice cool glass of milk on the kitchen table for her little girl when she came home from school. Pretty soon the front door slammed and in bounced Mary with her red braids switching like little ponytails. Her mother said, "How was school, darling?" Mary said as she gulped her milk and took a large bite of sandwich, "Well, this afternoon, Miss Crabtree said Mary O'Toole will stay in at recess and put the paint boxes away. And I said," Mary took another gulp of milk, "You're the teacher here, Miss Crabtree. Why don't you put away the paint boxes and let me go out and play?" Everybody in the whole room laughed, but mean old Miss Crabtree, she sent me to the corner. Mary took another large bite and looked up at her mother, expecting to see if she would appreciate how smart she was. However, her mother said, "That was a really rude thing for you to do, Mary, and I'm ashamed of you. When you finish your sandwich and your milk, you'd better go up to your room and stay until dinner. You can concentrate on how rude you were to nice Miss Crabtree." Mary pulled down her mouth at the corner and squinted up her pretty brown eyes and said, "Why should I?" She kept her mouth pulled down and blinked her eyes rapidly in a most disagreeable way. Mrs. O'Toole was dumbfounded. Never had her little Mary acted in this horrid way before. She quietly said, "You should do it because I told you. Now, scat." Mary walked out of the kitchen, switching her skirt and braids and managing to look impudent even from the back. When she reached the top of the stairs, she called down to her mother, "I'm gonna do it because I want to, not because you told me," and dashed into her room and banged the door. That night at dinner, Mary was quite normal, but after dinner, her daddy said, "Scoot the dishes off the table, Win. Your mammy's tired." And his dear little Win, instead of jumping up and doing what she was told, pulled her mouth down so she looked like a sad jack-o'-lantern, squinted up her eyes and said, "I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to. Anyway, you eat here, why don't you clear the table?" She blinked her eyes rapidly. Her father looked as though he was going to explode, but then he noticed that it was time for the news, so instead he went into his study and turned on the television and lit his pipe. Mary did clear off the table, and she dried the dishes, but she kept blinking her eyes and muttering. The next morning, her mother said, "Please hurry with your breakfast, Mary. The children are waiting. You'll make them late for school." Mary pulled her mouth down and began blinking. She said, "I'm the one eating breakfast, madam," and she pronounced it madam. Mary's mother sighed and said, "If you only knew how unattractive you look when you talk like that, you would stop right now." Mary mumbled something into her mush, then grabbed her sweater and slammed out the front door. Mrs. O'Toole went to the telephone and called her friend Mrs. Ragbag. She said, "Hello, Mrs. Ragbag, have you noticed any change in Calliope lately?" Mrs. Ragbag said, "Well, no, can't say as I have, Miss O'Toole. She seems to be studying hard in school, and she eats and sleeps well. Have you noticed anything wrong with her?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "No, it's not Calliope I'm worried about. It's Mary. Yesterday afternoon she came home from school and she seemed perfectly normal and looked all right, but she told me how very impudent she had been in school. Well, I sent her to her room, of course. In fact, I sent her there until dinner because she was impudent to me as well. She was rude to her father, too. I just cannot understand it. I thought perhaps all the children were acting this way. She pulls her mouth down, squints up her eyes, and blinks. She looks hideous." Mrs. Ragbag said, "Oh, I am so sorry, Mrs. O'Toole, because Mary's always been such a dear, sweet little girl. I don't know what to suggest. Why don't you call Mrs. Keystop? You know what a problem her little Chucky is. She should have some ideas." Mrs. O'Toole said, "Thank you very much, Mrs. Ragbag. I'll call Mrs. Keystop right now." So she called Mrs. Keystop, but she was not at home, and the maid, Nora, answered the phone. Nora said, "Sure, and Mrs. Keystop ain't home, Mrs. O'Toole. But how is that dear little Mary, the one with the beautiful braids?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "Oh, Nora, that's just why I called. Mary has suddenly become so impudent. She answers back and she pulls her mouth down and squints her eyes up. She started yesterday and I'm so upset. I called to ask Mrs. Keystop if she has ever had any similar trouble with Chucky." Nora said, "Sure, and there ain't any trouble she's had with Chucky. He's so rude he talks back to himself. But I'm thinking you best call Mrs. Piggle Wiggle. That little woman has forgotten more about children than we'll ever know. She even taught Hubert Prentice how to pick up his toys. Now there's a spoilt child." Mrs. O'Toole said, "Thank you so much, Nora. I should have thought of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle in the first place. I'll call her right now." Mrs. O'Toole called Mrs. Piggle Wiggle and said, "Oh, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, I'm so worried about my little girl, Mary." Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "I know Mary. She has such beautiful red hair and lovely brown eyes." Mrs. O'Toole said, "Well, she has the hair anyway, but her eyes don't look pretty anymore. She squints them and pulls down her mouth and then blinks." Mrs. Piggle Wiggle says, "She answers back and is impudent, isn't she?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "Yes, she is, but how did you know? I hope she hasn't been rude to you." Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "Oh, no, Mary is always very polite to me, but I can recognize the answer back symptoms. When was she first impudent?" "Yesterday afternoon, right after school. She was rude to dear Miss Crabtree, your teacher, and then when I sent her to her room, she made this hideous face and said, 'I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to.' Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, she walks and stalks in such a way that her braids twitch and even her back looks impudent." Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "Don't worry, Mrs. O'Toole. Some of the most charming children I know were once answer backers. Fortunately, Mary has only begun, so she can be cured in no time at all. You drop by here after lunch, and I will give you Penelope Parrot to keep for a while. Mrs. Garrison has been using Penelope, but she's had her for a month now, and Gary should be cured by this time. Now, don't worry, Mrs. O'Toole. Penelope is the cure for even the most stubborn cases of answer backishness." Mrs. O'Toole hung up the phone and felt much better. Right after lunch, she headed down to Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's house and got Penelope. Penelope Parrot was a large, cross-looking green bird who blinked rapidly. Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said as she handed the cage to Mrs. O'Toole, "Fortunately for you, Penelope will only talk to children." During the walk home from Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's house, Penelope was quite in a very cross, blinky-eyed sort of way, and when Mrs. O'Toole hung her cage up in the kitchen, she hunched down and put her head under her wing. But when Mary came home, Penelope woke up and began preening her feathers. Mary was delighted with Penelope. She said, "Oh, Mother, I've always wanted a parrot. Do you think she can talk?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "Well, she hasn't said a word since I brought her home, but I was told she speaks only to children." Mary said, "Where did you get her, Mother? Is she for me? May I have her in my room for my very own?" Her mother said, "I'm keeping her for a friend of mine, but when you play in your room, you may hang her cage by the window." Mary brought her milk and cookie over by Penelope's cage and was very surprised when Penelope blinked and said rudely, "Give me a bite, pig." Mary broke off a piece of the cookie and poked it through the bars of the cage. Penelope snatched it and said, "Thanks, pig." Mary turned to her mother. "She's certainly not very polite, is she?" Her mother said, "Well, perhaps she's been around rude people. After all, she is only a parent and repeats what she hears." Penelope blinked her eyes and said, "Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah." Mrs. O'Toole looked a little shocked, but Mary laughed and said, "May I bring the children to see her, Mother, may I?" Before Mrs. O'Toole could answer, Penelope began hopping up and down and blinking, saying, "Say, are you the boss around here? Are you the boss around here? Are you the boss around here?" Mary's mother said, "I am the boss around here, Penelope, and if you are not more courteous, I'll put a cloth over your cage." Penelope blinked and muttered. Mary bounced up and down excitedly. "What will that do, Mother? What will it do to Penelope?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "If I put a cloth over her cage, she will think it is night and she will go to sleep." Penelope squawked, "I'll do it because you want to, not because you tell me to." Mary was certainly surprised at that, because she thought she had made up that brilliant remark. She didn't dare look at her mother, so she put on her sweater and went out to find her playmates. Pretty soon she came back in with 5 little friends, and they spent the afternoon standing around Penelope's cage and laughing at her rude remarks. This worried Mrs. O'Toole. If Mary thought Penelope was so amusing, then perhaps she would imitate her and become ruder than ever. So she called Mrs. Piggle Wiggle and said in a low voice so the children in the kitchen could not hear her, "Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, I'm rather worried because Penelope is very rude to the children, and they don't mind at all. Mary thinks it's very funny and just laughs at everything she says." Mrs. Piggle Wiggle said, "Just remember, Mrs. O'Toole, that this is only the very first day with Penelope. Let Mary be with her as much as she wishes. Keep Penelope's cage in the breakfast nook where Mary eats her lunch and breakfast, and in the dining room at night. Hang her cage in Mary's bedroom when she goes up there to play, and have Penelope sleep in Mary's room. I'm sure that you do not have to worry. Penelope has never failed me." Mrs. O'Toole said, "All right, Mrs. Piggle Wiggle, I'll do just as you said. Goodbye." Just before dinner, Mrs. O'Toole said to Mary, "Mary, send your dear little friends home now. It's time for you to set the table." Mary turned to her mother and began pulling down her mouth and squinting her eyes and blinking. But before she could say a word, Penelope yelled out, "Say, who's the boss around here? Who's the boss? Who's the boss here anyway?" Mary's mother quickly put the cloth over the cage, politely asked the children to leave, and sent Mary in to set the table. When Mr. O'Toole came home from the office, she took the cover off to show him the parrot, and then she hung Penelope in the dining room window. After dinner, Mary's dad said, "Up on your toes, Miss Molly O'Toole, and scoot to the kitchen to do the dishes." Mary pulled her mouth down, squinted up her eyes, and blinked, but Penelope said, "What am I, a servant? Work, work, work. What am I, a servant? Who says you're the boss around here?" Mary's daddy laughed so hard the tears ran down his cheeks, but Mary stuck out her tongue at Penelope, who bounced up and yelled, "Only snakes stick out their tongues! Only snakes stick out their tongues!" Mary pulled in her tongue so quickly and shut her lips together tight. My, but she thought Penelope was horrid. Mrs. O'Toole hung Penelope's cage in Mary's room, and Penelope squawked and made so much noise that Mary finally said, "Oh, be quiet!" And Penelope blinked and said, "I'll do it because you want to, not because you tell me to. I'll do it because I want to, not because you tell me to." Mary flounced into bed and turned off the light. The next morning, Mary was very slow. She could not find one of her socks and could not button her dress, and finally her mother called, "Mary, hurry, dear, breakfast is waiting." Mary pulled down her mouth and squinted up her eyes and said, "Oh, hurry, 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 hurry yourself." Penelope had been preening her tail feathers, but when she heard Mary, she jerked up her head and said, "Oh, hurry, 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 hurry yourself, Slowpoke, hurry yourself, Slowpoke, hurry, Slowpoke, hurry, Slowpoke, hurry, Slowpoke, hurry, hurry, hurry." Mary said crossly, "Oh, be quiet, Penelope." And here is a picture of Mary and Penelope. Penelope said, "I'll do it because I want to, not because you told me to. Say, who's the boss around here? Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah." Mary ran downstairs to breakfast, leaving Penelope still shouting. But Mrs. O'Toole ran upstairs and got Penelope and hung her cage by the kitchen window. When the children called for Mary and Mrs. O'Toole said, "Hurry, dear, you'll make your friends late for school," Mary pulled down her mouth and squinted up her eyes and blinked, but before she could say a word, Penelope squawked, "I'm the one who's eating breakfast, madam. Hurry, hurry, hurry. That's all I hear. Hurry yourself, Slowpoke." Mary was ashamed to look at her mother, so she rushed off without kissing her goodbye. Penelope yelled after her, "Hurry, Slowpoke, bell's ringing, bell's ringing." When Mary came home from school that afternoon, she kissed her mother and said, "Mother, I apologized to Miss Crabtree today, and she said that next week I may be the monitor for the scissors. Penelope yelled, "Who said so? Who said so? Who said so? Who's the boss? Who's the boss?" Mary turned to Penelope and said, "You are a very rude bird. If you don't hush right now, I'll put the cover over your cage." Penelope blinked and said, "Hush, hush, hush, that's all I hear. I'll do it because I want to, not because you told me to. I'll do it because I want to, not because you told me to. Who's the boss around here anyway?" Mary's mother said, "I am the boss, and I think it's time you went home, Penelope. Mary, would you like to return Penelope to Mrs. Piggle Wiggle?" Mary said, "Oh, yes, Mother, and may I stay and play?" Mrs. O'Toole said, "I think you'd better come home and practice. Your music lesson's tomorrow, you know." Mary started to draw her mouth down and squint up her eyes, but suddenly she looked at Penelope, and so she turned up her mouth and opened her eyes and smiled and said, "All right, Mother, I'll come right home after I return the rude Penelope." And that's the end of chapter 3, The Answer Backer's Cure, from Miss Piggle Wiggle by Betty MacDonald. Tomorrow will be chapter 4. Remember, if you want to be notified when chapter 4 is going to be ready, look for the subscribe button underneath the video and just push that button. Bye.